the psychological mirror of God. Before you ever questioned God, did you ever question what your idea of God says about you? Because if human beings were the ones who created gods, carved myths from fear, wonder, and unanswered questions, then the real revelation may not be who the gods are, but how humanity secretly sees itself. Think about that. Across history, across continents, across civilizations that never touched, people looked at thunder, death, chaos, stars, suffering, and mystery, then built divine beings to explain what terrified them. But in doing so, they also wrote themselves into the story. And what role did they choose? Not equals, not creators, not even confident children of the cosmos. Again and again, humanity placed itself beneath the heavens, not just lower, but smaller, frail, sinful, disposable, blind, dependent, creatures made to obey, souls born unworthy, beings who must kneel, serve, sacrifice, repent, or prove their right to matter. And that is where this becomes deeply personal, because mythology may not only be about explaining the universe, it may be one of the oldest psychological mirrors ever created. A mirror that reveals how humans have often perceived their own value. These stories were never just entertainment. They were training. They shaped identity. They taught entire civilizations whether they were sacred participants in existence or cosmic mistakes stumbling through a hostile universe. They whispered whether human life carried divine partnership or whether it existed merely to serve powers beyond comprehension. And when those whispers are repeated for generations, they become more than stories. They become mental architecture, inherited identity. And inherited shame is often most powerful when it becomes invisible. When people no longer recognize it as a story they were taught, but as an objective fact about who they are. This is how psychological inheritance survives. One generation's fear becomes the next generation's identity. One culture's survival strategy becomes another person's private self-hatred. And unless examined, people may spend entire lives defending wounds they did not consciously choose. They become the invisible script through which people understand their worth. Before most people choose identity, they inherit it, small or sacred, broken or meaningful, dependent or capable. This is why myth matters so deeply. Because the stories surrounding a person can become the architecture inside a person. Long before philosophy, many human beings were already being taught whether their existence was dignity or debt. What if the oldest myths did not only teach us how to see the gods, but how to see ourselves before we were even old enough to question it? Because once a culture repeats that you are small, flawed, indebted, or born beneath something greater, that story rarely stays in temples. It enters parenting, it enters law, it enters love. It becomes the child who believes approval must be earned, the adult who apologizes for existing, the soul that confuses obedience with worthiness, and that may be one of mythology's deepest powers. It does not merely explain the cosmos outside you, it quietly colonizes the cosmos within you. So when cultures repeatedly imagine humanity as weak before the gods, guilty before the gods, or born in debt to the gods, we have to ask a far more uncomfortable question. Were we describing divine truth, or were we revealing our own psychological wounds? Today, we are going to journey through myths, religions, and folklore from across the world, not just to examine what they say about gods, but to uncover what they confess about us. Then we will step beyond myth into psychology itself, to ask why the human mind so often diminishes itself before its own creations, and whether in the modern world we can reclaim a healthier, stronger vision of what it truly means to be human. Humanity beneath the gods. Now we descend into the oldest mirrors humanity ever built, because long before psychology had language, myth was already revealing the architecture of the human soul. Civilization after civilization looked upward, imagined powers greater than themselves, and then answered one terrifying question. If gods exist above us, then what exactly are we beneath them? In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest recorded answers was brutally clear. Human beings were labor, utility, workforce. In the Mesopotamian imagination, humanity was not sculpted from divine romance or cosmic affection. We were created because the gods were tired. In Mesopotamia, humanity's first mythic role was simple: bear the burden. The cosmos was imagined as hierarchy, and humanity entered it at the bottom. Useful, necessary perhaps, but fundamentally instrumental. We were not sacred because we existed. We existed because we were useful. And that idea should feel unsettling, because it echoes one of humanity's deepest fears. What if my value is not inherent? What if I matter only because I serve? Then we move into the biblical tradition, where the psychological complexity deepens. Here, humanity begins with astonishing dignity, created in the image of God, imago Dei, a staggering claim. Not cattle, not accident, reflection. Humanity here starts with divine resemblance, worth, purpose, intimacy. But almost immediately the story fractures. The fall enters, sin enters, shame enters. The creature made in sacred image becomes broken, guilty, cast down, dust and returned to dust, born into sin, filthy rags, deserving death, slaves to righteousness. And suddenly humanity exists in a painful tension between glory and guilt. You are made in divine likeness, yet morally corrupted. You are beloved, yet fallen, elevated, yet condemned. This is psychologically powerful because it creates both dignity and dependence. You matter immensely, but you are also fundamentally broken. You are not merely weak, you are flawed at the core. That duality can inspire profound purpose, but it can also produce immense psychological burden. It asks the human being to carry both sacred identity and chronic unworthiness, to believe you were made for more, but cannot reach it alone. At that point, mythology is no longer ancient. It is attachment psychology. Then comes Greece, where the humiliation shifts from moral to existential. Greek mythology often dazzles us with heroes, demigods, and legends, but beneath that splendor lies a sobering truth about ordinary mortals. Humans are creatures of a day, brief, frail, disposable. In Homer, generations of men fall like leaves. In Prometheus Bound, humanity is described as blind, helpless, ephemeral. Greek thought does not obsess as much over humanity being filthy. Instead, it emphasizes our smallness, our mortality, our insignificance before immortal beings whose scale dwarfs us. The gods are not necessarily morally superior. Often they are petty, vain, cruel, or impulsive, but they are more powerful, more enduring, less vulnerable to consequence, and that alone establishes superiority. Here, humanity's wound is not sin, it is impermanence. You are not disgusting, you are temporary, you are not evil, you are fragile. This fear still echoes every time we wonder whether our small life can truly mean anything in a vast world. Sometimes, faced with vastness, humans survive by shrinking first, but survival can become self-erasure. Learning scale but losing self. Because to be mortal in a world of immortals is to constantly feel like your life flickers at the edge of something vastly larger than you. Egypt offers another fascinating variation. Humans are often described as the cattle of the gods, but cattle are still possessions, property, managed beings. In the Book of the Heavenly Cow, humanity may reflect divine image, but rebellion changes everything. When humans resist divine order, punishment comes swiftly. Hathor becomes destruction. Domination restores hierarchy. Egyptian mythology can portray humanity as cherished, but only within obedience. The psychological message is subtle yet potent. You may matter, but as something possessed. You may be valued, but not fully free. Your worth exists within the system that claims you. Then Norse mythology enters with cold wind and hard honesty. Here the deepest wound is death. Mortality is not hidden. It is central. Cattle die, kinsmen die. You yourself will die. Norse tradition does not always obsess over human filth or guilt. It confronts limitation directly. Doom is real. Fate is relentless. Even gods move toward Ragnarok. Here, humanity is not uniquely degraded. Everyone faces ending. If death is unavoidable, then meaning must come from courage, reputation, glory, and how one stands before inevitable collapse. Norse thought accepts the ceiling, but still asks what kind of person you become beneath it. Then another civilization answered differently, where hierarchy becomes cosmic structure. Humans exist between mortal fragility and divine immortality. The gods occupy higher planes, while humans navigate precarious existence below. Mortality, suffering, uncertainty remain, but unlike some traditions, there is often access upward through ritual, sacrifice, meditation, dharma, divine order. Humanity is not necessarily despised, but it is undeniably positioned within hierarchy. We are vulnerable beings who may, through alignment, touch blessing. Humans are precarious, but not hopeless. They recognize weakness, yet still seek transcendence. We bow, not always from humiliation, but from longing. The hierarchy remains, yet pathways exist. Then the Maya Kich tradition in the Popol Vuh introduces a startlingly intimate anxiety. Early human creations fail because they lack heart and mind. They are incomplete, defective, destroyed. Later, humanity succeeds, but then another fear emerges. Humans may become too perceptive, too capable, too godlike, so their sight is clouded, their vision limited. Here we encounter divine gatekeeping. Humanity is allowed enough consciousness to function, but not enough to rival. Then the Aztecs made the debt unmistakable, makes debt terrifyingly explicit. Human life is nourishment, blood, obligation, repayment. Humans exist indebted to the gods, tasked with sustaining cosmic order through sacrifice. Flesh feeds divinity, blood keeps the sun moving. Here, subordination becomes visceral. Humanity is not merely beneath, humanity owes. Existence itself is debt. This is one of the starkest mythic expressions of a recurring human fear. What if being alive means I already owe something greater than myself? What if my life is not gift, but payment? Why humans keep diminishing themselves. And now, after crossing these civilizations, these symbols, these heavens, we must ask the deeper question. Why do humans so often imagine themselves this way? Why do so many stories place us beneath, burdened, flawed, indebted, fragile, or controlled? The first answer may be simple. Myth gives order to chaos. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We cannot tolerate pure randomness for long. Death, drought, disease, famine, earthquake, loss. These forces feel unbearable when meaningless. So myth gives them face, voice, intention. Gods emerge where chaos once stood, but once those powers are personified, hierarchy follows naturally. If there are beings above storms, death, or fate, then where do we stand? Beneath. Myth maps the cosmos, and in doing so, maps us. It tells us what we are, relative to terror. It explains suffering by embedding it into structure. The second answer is harder. Sometimes self-diminishment feels safer than freedom, because random suffering is psychologically brutal. But suffering that is deserved, ordained, or meaningful can be endured. If I suffer because I am sinful, or small, or indebted, that may hurt, but at least it makes sense. Chaos becomes system. Pain becomes narrative. Many people would rather be servants in a meaningful cosmos. And perhaps the strangest part is that even when old gods fade, the psychological pattern often survives. Because humans rarely stop worshiping, we simply rename what stands above us: nation, success, status, ideology, beauty, productivity, public approval. We still create higher powers. We still shrink ourselves beneath them. The altar changes. The script often does not. The ancient heavens may fade, yet the deeper pattern often survives through new measurements. Followers, wealth, beauty, achievement, relevance. Many modern people still wake each day asking an old mythic question in updated language. Am I enough now? Have I finally earned significance? The gods may look different, but insecurity still knows how to kneel. Today, many people no longer bow before thunder gods, but they still kneel before algorithms, before beauty standards, before wealth metrics, before institutional approval, before public perception. We still ask invisible forces to determine whether we are enough. We still sacrifice peace for validation. We still fear exile from the tribe. In that sense, modernity did not eliminate mythic psychology. It industrialized it. The names changed. The heavens became digital. But the ancient question remains: what must I become to deserve worth in the eyes of something greater than me? Which means the deepest myth may not be religious at all. It may be the human tendency to keep outsourcing worth. Many would rather be servants in a meaningful cosmos than free beings in an indifferent universe. Freedom can terrify. Meaningful subordination can comfort. This is one of myth's deepest bargains. The price is humility, sometimes humiliation, but the reward is existential structure. Then there is society itself. Myths do not emerge outside culture. They often mirror it. Kings rule nations. Priests interpret mysteries. Tyrants dominate populations. Hierarchies shape civilization. So why would heaven look different? Often it does not. Divine systems frequently reflect political systems. Gods become cosmic kings. Humans become subjects. Sacred order mirrors social order. And once hierarchy becomes divine, challenging power becomes more dangerous. Because now rebellion is not only political, it is spiritual. Shame then becomes one of the most powerful tools in this system. If humans are taught they are fallen, filthy, weak, disposable, or inherently insufficient, dependence increases. Shame lowers resistance. Shame creates need. Suddenly intermediaries become essential. Priests, rituals, kings, laws, sacrifices, saviors. If humanity can be convinced that its natural state is inadequacy, control becomes easier. Because control becomes far easier when people internalize inferiority. A person who believes they are naturally unworthy often polices themselves before power ever has to. They shrink preemptively. They doubt instinctively. They may even protect the very systems that diminish them, because challenging those systems can feel like challenging reality itself. This is how hierarchy can move from external force into internal identity. Then systems of control can present themselves as salvation. But fairness matters here. Not all of this is manipulation. Myths are also wrestling honestly with reality. Humans are fragile. We do die. We are morally inconsistent. We do fear what we cannot control. We are often overwhelmed by forces larger than ourselves: storms, grief, disease, mortality, nature, time. Myth did not invent those vulnerabilities. It interpreted them. The danger begins when limitation becomes equated with worthlessness. Because fragility is true, mortality is true, fear is true. But from those truths, humanity has often leapt to a darker conclusion: that because we are limited, we must also be lesser in essence. That because we die, we are insignificant. That because we fear, we deserve domination. And that may be one of the oldest psychological wounds our species carries. So, perhaps the real revelation hidden inside mythology is not that humans feared gods, but that humans feared their own smallness so deeply they encoded it into heaven itself. Yet limitation is real, and still, worthlessness never had to be. So maybe the real task is not to destroy every myth, because humans seem built for story. Maybe the task is to ask which stories make us more whole, and which ones teach unnecessary shame, which narratives cultivate courage, and which ones domesticate fear, which ones remind us of responsibility, and which ones convince us that dignity itself must be surrendered. Because if stories helped shape humanity's self-image, then new stories may help repair it. Not fantasies of perfection, not delusions of supremacy, but narratives where being finite does not mean being fundamentally lesser. The invisible script still running. And maybe that is where this entire journey becomes painfully modern, because these myths are not only ancient stories carved into tablets or whispered through temples. For many people, they are still alive. Not always as religion, not always as doctrine, but as psychological code. Hidden scripts, quiet sentences running beneath consciousness. I am nothing. I deserve less. Who could truly love me? My suffering proves I am bad. Authority must know better. To question is arrogance, because for many human beings, the fear beneath obedience is not always punishment. Sometimes it is exile. To question inherited systems can feel dangerous, not only because you may be wrong, but because you may no longer belong. Family, community, identity, tribe, and for deeply social creatures, belonging can feel like survival itself. Which means people may silence their own perception not because they lack intelligence, but because the cost of independent thought can feel emotionally catastrophic. For many people, the deepest inherited fear is not punishment, it is the fear of thinking for themselves. Because once questioning is associated with pride, rebellion, betrayal, or danger, curiosity itself can begin to feel morally unsafe. The mind learns to hesitate before its own insight. The soul learns to distrust its own perception. And this may be one of the most powerful forms of diminishment imaginable, not merely being told what to think, but being trained to fear the act of thinking at all. At that point, obedience is no longer external. It becomes internal censorship. And over time, this can create one of the deepest forms of self-abandonment. A person may become so practiced at distrusting their own instincts that external permission begins to feel safer than inner truth. They may look outward before inward, authority before conscience, acceptance before honesty. At that point, diminishment is no longer something imposed, it becomes something rehearsed. And perhaps one of the deepest losses is this: when a human being no longer needs chains because they have learned to fear their own mind. So perhaps one of the most radical psychological recoveries is this: relearning permission. Permission to question. Permission to reflect. Permission to notice when fear has disguised itself as virtue. Permission to think without automatically assuming thought itself is betrayal. My role is obedience, not thought. Reclaiming human dignity. And when those beliefs live inside a person long enough, they do not feel like mythology. They feel like identity. That is why this conversation was never just about gods. It was about inheritance. About the old architectures still shaping how human beings measure their worth. Because there is a difference, a profound one, between humility and diminishment. Humility says, I am finite. I can be wrong. I am not the center of the universe. Humility is honest. It leaves room for wonder. It leaves room for growth. But diminishment twists that truth into something darker. Therefore, I am nothing. Therefore, I should shrink. Therefore, my voice does not matter. That is not wisdom. That is psychological surrender. Reclaiming dignity does not mean pretending humans are flawless, limitless, or divine. It means refusing the false choice between arrogance and self-erasure. There is a middle ground, honest humanity, one that can acknowledge weakness without worshiping inadequacy, one that can admit failure without building identity around shame. And maybe what humanity needs now is not the destruction of myth, but a humanist turn in how we carry it, a new posture, one where we can admit weakness without worshiping weakness, where we can face death without glorifying self-erasure, where we can confront moral failure without declaring humanity trash, where we can stand in awe before existence without kneeling in slavery before it. Because awe is not the same thing as humiliation. Wonder does not require self-hatred. Reverence does not require erasure. We do not have to keep describing ourselves in the language of cosmic shame just because our ancestors were afraid. Yes, we are fragile. Yes, we are imperfect. Yes, we are mortal. But none of that means we were born beneath dignity. None of that means consciousness itself is a mistake. Perhaps the healthiest future is one where we stop asking how to become smaller before the universe and start asking how to become more honest, more courageous, and more compassionate within it. Perhaps healing begins the moment a person realizes inherited narratives are influential but not absolute. So as you leave this conversation, do something ancient systems rarely encouraged enough. Examine the voice inside you. When you feel shame, ask who taught it to speak. When you feel small, ask whether that smallness is wisdom or inheritance. When fear tells you not to question that fear first. Notice where you have confused obedience with virtue, self-erasure with humility, or belonging with truth. You do not need to reject meaning, spirituality, or reverence. But you may need to reclaim authorship over the story shaping your worth. Because perhaps one of the most human acts is this: to consciously choose which beliefs deserve to live inside your mind. You may inherit a script without being sentenced to repeat it. Awareness itself can become revision. And sometimes the most radical act is not rebellion for its own sake, but consciously choosing a less diminished way to be human. The moment a person notices the script they inherited is not the same thing as truth. The moment they realize shame may be ancient, but it is not always sacred. The moment they understand that questioning diminishment is not arrogance, it may actually be psychological maturity. Because reclaiming human dignity does not require pretending we are gods. It simply requires refusing the lie that we were born as nothing. You do not need to believe you are the center of everything to remember that you are still something. You can be finite without being filth. You can be humbled without being erased. You can be mortal without being worthless. We get to choose. If something in you recognized itself here, do not ignore it. Stay with that discomfort. Awareness may be where inherited diminishment finally begins to end. And if this conversation helped you question inherited shame, reclaim thought, or remember your worth a little more clearly, then share it with someone else, still learning that being human was never the same thing as being nothing. Mortal does not mean worthless.